In a world where our voices are often drowned out by others' opinions and judgments, there are moments when silence breaks, and the truth forces its way into the open. We all have our breaking points, those moments when we can no longer sit quietly and let the world write our story for us. At Secret Affair Stories, we dive deep into the hidden truths, the unspoken emotions, and the powerful moments that change lives forever. And today, I want to share with you a story of one such moment, one that unfolded at a family gathering, where a mother's pain was turned into a punchline, and yet, in the midst of the laughter and cruelty, a small voice spoke louder than any of the adults present. This voice didn't just break the silence, it shattered the carefully constructed facade that had kept a family's secrets hidden for far too long. The world often tries to silence those who are hurting, but sometimes, the truth demands to be heard, no matter who tries to bury it. The stage was set for a silence that wouldn't last. There I was, standing in the corner of that chaotic backyard, my hands trembling as I gripped a plate of lukewarm ribs, trying desperately to keep my smile in place. The moment was surreal, the laughter around me sharp and cutting, like shards of glass piercing through the fragile facade I had carefully built. It wasn't the first time I'd found myself in a situation like this, but it felt like a scene straight out of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I had been here before, reduced to nothing more than a punchline in their twisted game of superiority. And then there she was. Loretta. Mai excuse-moi es modeur. Standing tall, glass of wine in hand, her lips twisted into that same tight-lipped smile that had always made me feel like I was less than nothing. But today, it wasn't enough to simply look at me with disdain. No, she had to make it public. She had to make sure everyone in that yard knew just how worthless she thought I was. With one fluid motion, she raised her glass high, her voice booming across the yard, unmistakable and sharp. She's a terrible mother, just like she was a terrible wife. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a brief moment, I thought I might collapse right there. The laughter that followed felt like a cruel symphony, a symphony that played just for me. Some chuckled lightly, others barely disguised their amusement, but it didn't matter. The weight of those words was suffocating. My heart raced, my cheeks burned, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the earth beneath me. To escape the laughter that seemed to echo off the fences, the walls, and straight into my soul. But I didn't run. Not yet. I told myself, stay calm. Stay composed. 4 miles. I turned my head slightly, trying to focus on anything other than the stairs, the whispers, the invisible weight pressing down on me. I found him. Miles. My 6-year-old son, sitting quietly on the patio steps, swinging his little legs back and forth. He was pretending not to hear, but I knew better. He always hears. His small eyes, brown and full of understanding, met mine. In that fleeting moment, I saw it, he knew. He knew exactly what was happening, even though the adults around us continued on with their charade, oblivious to the emotional wreckage they were causing. And then, the unexpected happened. Without a word, Miles stood up. In that instant, it felt like the whole backyard held its breath. No one noticed at first. I barely noticed. He moved silently, but with purpose, like he knew exactly what he was about to do. I watched, my heart hammering in my chest. What was he thinking? Why was he moving? Why now? He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself to stand out, and yet, there he was, little Miles, my sweet boy, marching towards the middle of the yard with the quiet determination of someone far beyond his years. The laughter around me stuttered, then stopped completely. The energy in the air shifted. The noise of the party, the clinking glasses, the idle chatter, it all ceased. The backyard, once full of warmth and smiles, suddenly felt cold, like the calm before a storm. Miles, in his damp Spider-Man shirt, looked up at me with those big brown eyes, wide as the sky itself. And in that moment, as he climbed onto a white plastic chair, all the years of hurt, humiliation, and silent suffering came rushing back. My son, my innocent, quiet son, was about to say something that none of us could ever take back. He stood tall, shoulders squared, like he had stepped into the role of a man far older than his 6 years. He wasn't just standing, he was making a statement. And when he opened his mouth, the world seemed to freeze, as though everything had been building up to this one single breathtaking moment. "Grandma," Miles said, his voice steady and clear, "I have something Dad doesn't want you to know." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew how to react. Some of the guests shifted awkwardly, unsure if this was a joke or some strange antic from a child who didn't understand the magnitude of the moment. But I knew. I knew this wasn't a joke. This wasn't some playful moment. This was my son, my child, standing up for me, for himself, for the truth.
Chad, maillexusban, froze.
His body stiffened as though someone had turned off the air in the room. I saw it, the panic in his eyes. The man who had spent years trying to control our lives, our story, was suddenly on the defensive. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out, trying to coax Miles down from the chair, as though this was just a silly mistake that would pass. But Miles didn't move. He stood there, his little body trembling not with fear, but with the weight of his own truth. His voice, when he spoke again, was louder this time, clearer, stronger than anything he had ever said before. I have something Dad doesn't want you to know. The crowd fell into a tense, uncomfortable silence. I could hear the soft clink of wind chimes on the porch. I could feel the moment stretching out, thick with anticipation. I knew what was coming, but I had no idea just how much it would shake everything to its core. What would come next would shatter everything, but it wouldn't come from me. It would come from Miles, and it would change everything. The way I saw my son, the way I saw myself, and the way this family would never look the same again. Stay tuned, because this story doesn't end here. It's just beginning. The moment that would change everything.
The silence unheavy in the air.
I watched as the adults around the yard exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Some shifted nervously in their seats, others swallowed their drinks too quickly, hoping to drown out what Miles had just said. But there was no escaping it. Not anymore. Chad, looking more like a deer caught in headlights than the confident man he pretended to be, took a step forward. His face turned a deep shade of red as he attempted to regain control. Miles, that's enough, he said, his voice strained.
Comme down, buddy.
We don't need to make a scene. But Miles didn't budge. His little body stood firm, his legs slightly trembling from the effort, but his gaze unwavering. There was a determination in his eyes that I had never seen before. He was a child, yes, but in that moment, he was wise beyond his years. It's not a scene, Miles said, his voice steady and clear, it's the truth. Chad stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time in years, I saw him stumble, not physically, but mentally. He had been the one to create the narrative. He had been the one who twisted the truth, who made me out to be the villain in this family. But now? Now the truth was coming from a 6-year-old boy, and that was something he couldn't control. The tension in the yard was thick. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Loretta, who had orchestrated the cruel words that started this whole thing, was now staring at Miles in stunned silence. Let the boy speak, she muttered, her voice a mere shadow of the confidence she had shown just moments before. Let him finish. But what was Miles about to say? My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow as I looked at him. I wanted to pull him down, shield him from whatever fallout would come next, but I knew he needed this. He needed to be heard. And for once, I wasn't going to stop him. Daddy says mean things about Mommy on the phone when he thinks I'm sleeping, Miles continued, his voice not shaking, but calm and unwavering. He says she's useless and broke, and that she ruined everything. The words landed with a crushing weight. He says she ruined everything. The sentence echoed in my mind, each word a stab of realization that, yes, this was real. This was the truth that I had tried to protect Miles from. This was the side of Chad I had tried to shield him from, but now he had seen it. He had heard it. He wasn't going to stay silent about it. The crowd's reaction was immediate. A few gasped, some looked away, and others simply sat frozen in place. Loretta's expression shifted from smugness to something I couldn't quite place. Shock, maybe? Fear? Whatever it was real. She had no words. None. The woman who had always had something cruel to say was now silent, her mouth slightly agape, unable to respond. Chad, desperate to regain control, took another step forward, his hand outstretched as if he could silence Miles with one simple gesture. Miles, that's enough, he said, his voice tight, the fake smile still lingering on his lips. But it was thin, too thin to hide the panic that was seeping through. We've talked about this. You don't need to bring up private conversations. Miles looked at him, his eyes steady, and said, it's not private if it makes people sad. There it was. The moment that changed everything. The moment I realized that my son, despite his young age, had more wisdom and courage than most adults ever would. He wasn't angry. He wasn't crying. He wasn't trying to create chaos. He was simply telling the truth. The uncomfortable, undeniable truth. Chad opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around for support, for someone to help him salvage his dignity, but there was no one. The crowd that had once laughed along with Loretta now sat in silence, many of them shifting awkwardly, looking at the ground or pretending to be interested in something, anything else. Loretta tried to cover up her discomfort, muttering something about children exaggerating. "They don't always understand," she said weakly, but the cracks in her facade were clear. She knew what she had just witnessed was not a child's imagination running wild. It was truth.
Ro, pinfultrus.
And then it happened. The silence that had taken over the yard wasn't just about the words Miles had spoken. It was the realization that something irreversible had just taken place. No one in that yard could deny what they had just heard. And I realized in that moment, I wasn't alone anymore. As Miles stepped down from that chair, the gravity of the moment still clung to the air like a thick fog. I stood frozen, watching my son make his way back to me, his small frame moving with a certain certainty that I hadn't expected. The tremors in my hands began to settle, but the ache in my chest, a mixture of pride, disbelief, and exhaustion, lingered. I knelt down, brushing the grass off his knees, and as he climbed into my arms, I could feel his heart thudding against mine. I squeezed him tighter than I ever had before, like he might slip away if I didn't hold him close enough. My little boy, who had always been the quiet observer, had just done something that no one, least of all me, had the courage to do. He spoke the truth. But my voice cracked as I whispered, "Why did you do that?" His answer, soft and matter-of-fact, was more powerful than anything I could have imagined. He looked up at me with those big brown eyes so full of wisdom and innocence that it made my heart ache. "Because you didn't say anything," he replied, his voice steady. "And someone had to." And just like that, a flood of realization washed over me. Miles hadn't just spoken for me, he had spoken for himself. For all the times he'd felt invisible, for all the moments when the adults around him tried to silence his feelings, he had found his voice. He needed them to see him, to see the truth. The truth wasn't just about the cruel words Loretta had thrown at me, or the way Chad had treated us. It was about something bigger. It was about honoring his own voice, his own story. And for the first time, the narrative was no longer being shaped by the lies and manipulation of the adults around us. We were writing it now. As I held him, his little arms wrapping around my neck, I felt like a new chapter had begun, not just for him but for me too. I had spent so many years trying to protect him from the ugliness of the world. I had thought that by staying quiet, by absorbing the insults, I was sparing him from the harsh realities of life. But in that moment, Miles showed me something so much more powerful. Silence only allows the lies to grow louder. And sometimes, speaking up isn't just about defending yourself. It's about protecting the future, breaking the cycle, and giving your children the strength to do the same. As we walked toward the gate, my hand in his, I felt the eyes of the crowd still heavy on us. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink away from their gaze, nor did I try to hide the weight of what had just happened. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom. Freedom not just from their judgment, but from the burden of their story that I had carried for so long. Miles was still small, his little legs unsteady with the weight of the moment, but he was walking with me, his head held high. He wasn't looking over his shoulder, and neither was I. This wasn't about looking back at the hurt or the humiliation. It wasn't about trying to make sense of a world that never made space for our truth. It was about moving forward. We didn't look back, not once. But as we reached the gate, something shifted in me. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that backyard earlier. I wasn't the same woman who had tried to smile through the pain, who had swallowed the insults and let them tear me down in silence. That woman was gone. She had been replaced by someone who had found her voice again, someone who had finally stopped apologizing for being who she was. And the most incredible part of it all? Miles had done it for us. The weight that had pressed down on me for years, those whispered judgments, the constant need to stay small and invisible, was now gone. And as we walked away, hand in hand, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for both of us. What happened next? The ride home was silent, but not in the way I had feared. The quiet that filled the car wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't heavy or suffocating like it had been before. It was peaceful. It was the silence of relief. As I buckled Miles into his booster seat and climbed into the front, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The air felt different. I felt different. Later that evening, as Miles was tucked into bed, his tiny chest rising and falling with each soft breath, I sat with my sister Ray, sipping tea that neither of us had touched. The weight of the day was still fresh, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. Ray turned to me, her expression a mix of concern and pride. "You know this changes things, right?" she said, her voice low, almost reverent. I nodded slowly, taking a long sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through me. "I think I'm ready for the change," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. The truth was, I had been running from this change for so long, afraid of the pain, afraid of the judgment, afraid of being exposed. But now, I felt ready to embrace it. The world didn't change overnight. Chad didn't magically transform into the man I had hoped he could be. He still tried to control the narrative, still played the victim when it suited him. But now, the power he had over me was gone. He could no longer manipulate my emotions, twist the truth, or use me as the villain in his story. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Miles had done something extraordinary. He had given me the courage to stand up for myself, to stop shrinking and letting others define me. And in the process, he had found his own strength, his own voice. Together, we had taken back our story. The next morning, after the dust had settled and life had resumed its usual rhythm, I received a text from Ray. She had seen Loretta's Facebook post. "Did you see what she posted?" Ray asked, barely able to contain her surprise. I sat up straighter, a sense of disbelief rushing through me. "What did she say?" Ray typed back quickly. "She said she's been deeply reflecting on how pain moves through generations." She didn't name names, but she quoted that part about secrets not being private if they hurt people. I sat back, stunned. Loretta, the woman who had torn me down for years, had just publicly acknowledged the truth. And though it wasn't a direct apology, it was something more. She had heard us. She had heard Miles. The final shift. The phone call from Chad came soon after, and I knew exactly what it would be. He was upset. He was defensive. "I don't know what you told him," he started, his voice tight with frustration. "I never used to talk like that. This isn't healthy, Jess." I let him vent, let him rage, let him try to twist this into something it wasn't. But when he paused for breath, I took my moment. I had heard it all before, but this time, I wasn't the one who would be silenced. "Do you know what's unhealthy, Chad?" I asked quietly, my voice steady. "Teaching a kid that love means staying silent while someone you care about is torn down." He didn't have a response. Instead, he tried to laugh it off, but I wasn't buying it anymore. "He understands more than you ever gave him credit for," I said, my voice firm, clear. "And I'm done pretending he's not listening. Because he is. He always has been." There was a long pause. And then, as if I had crossed some invisible line, Chad muttered, "So what, you're going to let him speak for you now?" I didn't hesitate. "No, I'm finally speaking for myself. He just had the guts to do it first." And with that, I ended the call. No more game. No more lies. A few days later, Loretta showed up at my door with a brown paper bag of muffins in hand, her face a picture of uncertainty. She had come to apologize. Or at least, that's what she said. But it wasn't the apology that mattered. It was the moment. The moment when Loretta finally saw the consequences of her cruelty, when she realized that her words, her actions had repercussions. Miles had shifted everything. Not just for me, but for her too. She handed me the muffins, her voice shaky as she said, "He's brave, your son." I nodded slowly, my heart swelling with pride for him. "He's mine." That night, as Miles drifted off to sleep, I whispered to him, "You didn't do anything bad. You did something brave. And you told the truth. That's never bad." In that moment, I realized the truth didn't just change our story, it changed me. It freed me. And now I finally understood that protecting our children doesn't mean hiding the truth, it means letting them speak it, even when their voices are small, shaky, and unexpected. That was the moment everything shifted. And that shift? It was the beginning of a new life. The beginning of a new life. As the days passed, things began to settle, but I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. My son had done something extraordinary. He had found his voice when I couldn't, and in doing so, he showed me the power of truth. The truth isn't always easy to hear, and it isn't always convenient, but it's what sets us free. And now, for the first time, I'm no longer carrying someone else's shame. I'm no longer trying to fit into a narrative that doesn't belong to me. I'm writing my own story, and so is Miles. If you've ever felt silenced, underestimated, or made to feel invisible, remember this: you have the power to take back your voice. It only takes one truth to break the lies, and sometimes, that truth comes from the most unexpected places. Let them speak, stand beside them, and remember that your truth, no matter how small or shaky, matters. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you're standing alone in the face of judgment, know that you're not alone. You have the strength to rewrite your story. At Secret Affairs Stories, we share stories that break the silence, that shatter the facades, and reveal the truths we all need to hear. If you believe in the power of truth, and if this story reminded you that you're not alone, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this today. Join us in this journey. Let's stop shrinking to make others comfortable, and start speaking up, for ourselves and for those who need to be heard. Thank you for being a part of this story. I'll see you in the next one, and remember, your voice matters.